Welcome to Total Network Operations with a very special episode today from Prague, the Czech Republic at AutoCon 3. This is May 2025 as we're recording, and I have a great guest with us today, Ernest Lefner, Chief Product Officer at Gluware. Ernest, welcome.
Thank you very much. I'm super excited to be here. NAF has been a blast.
Well, we'll get into that. I want to hear how much of a blast it's been for you. But before we dive in, let's get your background out there. You know, you've done some interesting things. We want to hear what you've touched on that really gives you connection with the ops community, net ops and operations in general, and things that can help elevate ops, people in ops roles, skills they can come on. I want to tease that out through the whole conversation today. But tell us about yourself, Ernest. What's your superhero origin story?
My superhero origin story. Well, I joined the Air Force when I was 16. I left home when I was 17 and spent 12 years in the military, having an absolute blast traveling the world, doing all the crazy things that you might think of, including here in the Czech Republic. After that, I got a job pulling cable. I ended up getting sick on one of my deployments and decided a career change. I was a registered nurse, a certificate nurse.
Wow.
And decided to get into IT.
Okay.
And upstate New York, pulling cable through fiber holes in Albany, New York was kind of how I got started. And then found my way to Boston, working at Fidelity to be a network engineer. And the rest is sort of history. Went to Bank of America, worked for EY, and now I'm at Gluware.
Got it. Well, let's tease out some things from that. Just in general, military experience can enforce a lot of discipline, gives you a real frame of reference. What kind of impact did that have on you?
One of the things that the military does is they have to turn over their workforce once every 3 years.
Sure.
So you really need to understand what's going on. So the scripts, the procedures, the training is all sort of spot on.
Right.
They need you to be ready in the least amount of time possible to handle the most complex tasks. And whether you're getting a C-130 ready for medical transport and you need how to set the stanchion poles and get the litters ready, all the way down to making sure the baggage tags and the patients are loaded properly. There's a lot that needs to be trained in a very short amount of time. So it really helps you understand where the priority is, and really, most importantly, what the mission is.
Sure.
And focusing on the mission to get that objective done.
I do a lot of work with government contractors and other organizations today. I'm close to DC, and they really show you what it means to have mission and understand mission, right? And we throw mission statements around a lot in corporate America. Doesn't really mean the same thing, right?
No. Yeah. No, it's a little bit different.
So as you made the leap into the private sector, you did eventually land pulling cable as a network engineer that was Fidelity?
I was actually with a company called Control Network Communications in upstate New York.
Yeah, I think so. I'm a Syracuse native.
Yeah.
And now I understand why we're both not in Syracuse or upstate New York anymore. I don't want to shovel any more of that white stuff.
Right.
But it's a good place to be from. It built character.
It absolutely did.
So what was that like? Pulling what kind of cable?
You want to know? I pulled fiber cable, 1,800 pair telco, Cat 5 back then, Cat 3, everything. You needed to get a fiber optic cable. I remember one of my first jobs was on Pine Street in Albany, and I was pulling splicing an 1,800 pair cable and learning how to, cable up all the wires, and you're stringing it all up in the color code and the whole nine. And I remember the slush, dripping down my back.
Yep.
And I thought to myself, this is the greatest thing I've ever done.
That's a pretty awesome feeling, isn't it? You don't care how bad that weather is, but you're doing something you're really engaged in.
Yeah, really. 1,800 people were going to have telephone service. You know what I mean? It was meaningful. You could see yourself start the project, finish the project. You knew that it was a skill not everyone understood. And it was tied to the computer industry, which, back in the 90s was a fledgling thing.
Sure.
And so it just was such a sense of fulfillment, and opportunity was limitless then.
So were you operating like a CLEC, or did you do work for New York Tel or 9X, whatever it was at that point?
No, we were a subcontractor for like MFS.
Okay.
Right? It was during the big fiber boom.
Sure.
And then we would also cable I was on the project that recabled the University at Albany.
Okay, sure.
And so we did things like that. Rensselaer Polytechnic Institute, which I went to work at a little bit later.
No kidding.
Yeah, exactly.
I thought about RPI. I ended up at RIT, other direction.
Rochester.
Yeah, sorry. Rochester's like one place I would go back to.
Well, you know what?
We really enjoyed
Rochester's really nice now. They've revitalized the downtown. It's totally different.
and they have dinosaur barbecue.
Yeah.
So
right.
the important things. So you got to crawl down into the manholes with the slush on your back.
You got it.
You seems like you made some progression there into network engineering roles.
Yep.
What did that look like?
Well, I did a job at RPI. I was telling you about where they were rolling out a laptop program, but they didn't have enough ports for all of the people to connect their laptops.
Sure.
And this was before Wi-Fi was ubiquitous.
Right.
And so I went there.
And reliable.
Exactly. And they said, hey, if you teach our folks how to do the layer 1 stuff, because it's so expensive, we'll teach you how to configure routers and switches.
Sure.
And 3 years later, Fidelity called me up and said, we want to move you to Boston to be a network engineer. And I joined their core infrastructure engineering team.
Pretty cool.
Yeah.
Do you have any thoughts on like the boom of access fiber today, like compared to what you saw, 30-ish years ago? I don't want to put a specific date on that.
Yeah, no, that's fair. Ultimately, fiber was a treasured commodity in the early days, right? If you had fiber, you were like, oh, it was like amazing. And then after the early 2000s hit, fiber became just another commodity that was everywhere.
Sure.
And then I think in the 2000s, it started to become just a little bit more scarce as everybody was building private optical networks. And now that building private optical networks is the standard, you see that fiber's everywhere. It's being put back in the ground,
yep.
and we're seeing that growth. And I think a little of that was technological, right? They're making fiber better.
Yep. Yep. That's been really, I think the promise of fixed wireless access has not delivered what many of the wireless providers had told us it would. And it became really obvious that there's no rain fade with fiber, right?
Yeah, you're absolutely right. I thought for sure 5G was going to really change that.
Sure.
Especially for local access in tough places. But it turns out, the CVS down the corner has still got to get a T1 because copper's the only thing still in that building.
Yeah. And, I could go on. I do other 5G related work. 5G is not for humans, right? All the special sauce that's built into 5G. There's nothing better about Netflix on my phone with 5G versus LTE.
Yeah.
Right. And I think, there's a little, I don't want to call it buyer's remorse, right? But there's I'm paying, I have this new plan that costs me $12 or $15 more a month, and it really doesn't do anything different for me. Now that 6G is being talked about, I know I'm going off topic and we'll park this soon, I promise. We got to figure out, and the carriers have to figure out, okay, what's the trade-off between upgrading all my radio infrastructure yet again, and figuring out, versus what more is this going to do for the people who are paying the bills?
Yeah, especially when a huge chunk of the planet's still on 3G.
Right. Yeah.
Yep.
There's always that coexistence, right? 3G to 4G, 4G to 5G, right? And 3G ubiquity, across the planet. So
yeah, I'm not sure 6G is really going to have that big of an impact, mainly because we can get almost unlimited bandwidth to the devices we have now.
Way more than
than
we can tap into.
Right.
Yeah. So back to the Ernest engineering progression. So landing in network engineering and other responsibility for infrastructure in the financial services industry.
Yes.
That seems pretty intimidating.
It was terrifying at first.
Okay.
I went from, a really military-based background, and layer 1 to sitting next to MIT grads. I didn't go to college, so I sat next to MIT grads and BU grads who I felt were far smarter and more brilliant. And ultimately what I found out was work ethic is everything.
Yeah.
And so I really just dug in and wanted to become an expert. And I wanted to be not a big fish in a small pond, but a big fish in a big pond. I wanted to have an impact. I wanted to have a say. And I wanted the executive leadership team to know that they could count on me to deliver business objectives. And that's really what I did. I went from BU to BU within Fidelity and learned all how the business operated, what were the key applications that they used, what were the outcomes that were driven as a result of that, and what was the network's, portion of delivering that value. And that's what I focused on.
So that's a really important thing to tease out here, especially for somebody who's in an ops role and might want to move on someday. You obviously started with real hands-on experience. You probably did some self-education
100%
on the tech and the business.
That's right.
And how did you figure out how to balance those two things or combine those two things?
Some of it was opportunity. Really what happened was as I would work with the business units, they would all have some of their own specific requirements. But, in the end, they all kind of came down to, I need better latency, more bandwidth, et cetera. So it was all about being able to engineer the solutions they needed within the specs of what we delivered, from an enterprise perspective, quickly and on their time.
Right.
And then really helping them understand what the benefit of that investment was. And so, Fidelity did some unique things, like they packaged all their own market data back up and sent that out to our customers, our high net worth customers. So we had to run our own market data plan.
Okay.
So we're pulling Itch 3.1 and Options Direct and all these big feeds coming from the market. And we needed to have that huge high speed infrastructure to be able to trickle that all down to a feed that would go to you in your house. And so understanding what a tick was and what that meant to a customer that was sitting at home and why.
What is a tick?
A tick is a symbol that's the value for a stock or other equity. And so when that tick would end up going to you, it needed to be there as fast as possible so you could not get eaten alive. And then when things like dark pools of liquidity started showing up, which essentially means that two different institutions were trading between each other instead of going to the market. And so that really started, then custom networks, fiber networks between companies started to become really important. B2B really started to flash. And when you understood that and you could articulate to an executive what 10 millisecond latency savings meant for them, and then the quants could tell you behind the scenes what kind of revenue they could generate off of that, then that's a direct correlation to money in the pocket of your company from the IT change. And you have to look for those opportunities to showcase that you can push the company forward.
All I could think of is Jonah Hill and Moneyball when you start talking about quants. So,
but there are groups, there are rooms and rooms of people either playing poker or watching computers that are trading real time based on algorithmic information. And the faster and fresher that data is, the more money they can make over everyone else.
So you really, really had to understand what was happening at the business level in the industry, and also understand, what it takes to build the right bit pipes.
That's right.
To transmit that information. Did you, you obviously went from one to the other over time, right? What did that look like over a 4-year period, 6-year period?
That's interesting. So I started at Fidelity in 2000, got called to active duty for 9/11. And then when I came back after 9/11, I really started working in the market space. And that's, I think, where a big differentiator was. By 2007, I had gone, so when I started, I was like one level above an intern. I was a brand new engineer. And that was in 2000. And then by 2007, I was a director.
Okay.
And then I moved to Dallas, and we were going through the productization process at that point in time. And they needed someone that understood the business of what we did, the technology of networking, and I was really good with money, finance, and planning. So they came to me and said, hey, we're going to make you VP. I made VP at 35, the youngest in the company, and the first internal promotion at the time in 5 years to vice president. And so I took over and then helped our boss at the time, Jim Davis, transform the whole P&L for network and bring costs down and get them in control and bring a whole product-centric approach to how we delivered services and networks.
So how did you drive cost of network down? Like what are real mechanisms that you had to put into play to do that?
That's a great question. First and foremost, you need to understand what's being consumed. Those telecom bills, and I'm sure a lot of the people listening to this podcast know this, right? The 20% of the revenue generated by the telecom carriers, not maliciously, is all due to billing errors.
Right.
So if you just understand what's happening from an invoice perspective and what's being used, then you can make a big change. And one of my colleagues, Justin, he ran a telecom expense management process, and it just absolutely crushed. And he saved, all kinds of crazy money. And then secondarily, we took a shot at cracking the incumbency, right? We opened up the network to more than maybe just that one vendor everybody was buying at the time. We had a very, very strong engineering team, and we laid out, hey, well, which vendors meet the requirements? Right. And then once that was validated by the engineering team, then now we could leverage sourcing events. Right. I didn't care if we picked Brocade, Cisco, HP, or whatever.
Sure.
I just needed to make sure the solution would fit. And once you've set that kind of standard, then really it's an e-commerce event.
Sure.
And it's who wants the business the most.
Sure. And there's a lot of ways in which I feel like you're the photo negative of what I was. I wanted to avoid financial conversations, accounting conversations, understanding the value. I figured this out much later in my career. I think there are a lot more people like me than there are like you. What would you tell folks that are running away from, I don't want to talk about, what the CFO wants to hear, or the COO wants to hear. I know now from experience that was a set of bad decisions on my part.
Yeah.
What would is there a nugget or a couple things you could throw at people to say you really shouldn't run from that stuff?
Everyone respects so why were you running? You were running because you fundamentally didn't understand the situation and how to deal with it.
You ain't kidding. Yeah.
And that's perfectly, but people are really afraid to say that. One of the things that I really embrace is if I don't know, or if I make a mistake, I just say it. Like, hey, I screwed up. Like, you know what? I really don't understand what you're talking about. Can you help me? And I have never met an executive ever that if you go up to them and say, hey, you know what? I really don't understand. Can you help me understand? That they won't help you understand. Because the more you know about depreciation and life cycle and maintenance recovery and all of those things, the better educated decisions you can make about the platforms that you're buying.
Right.
And so my recommendation would be, one, find a mentor, find someone in the know.
Sure.
Don't be afraid to ask the questions.
Yep.
Be a lifelong learner, right? Be curious. And what that will do is, you might not need that today, but how many times have you had a conversation with someone and you learn something new and 3 days later, you're in a conversation, you're like, oh my God, I just heard about this, right?
Yeah.
And the same thing happens in the corporate world. The more you learn about the business and the financial aspects of what you do, the better you can justify what you're doing.
Yeah. Amen to that. And, again, just something I wish I had, I wish I had this conversation with you 25 years ago.
I didn't, I've had a couple really, really good mentors along the way.
Sure.
My biggest fear in life is that I've wasted a moment of time.
And you feel like you're doing really well on that point. Like, I hope this contributes to that conversation right here, this conversation.
100%. I'm at the point now where it's about giving back, not about taking. So
yeah, no, I hear you. I think too, there's been a culture in technical disciplines where it used to be really cool to beat your chest and tell people what an idiot they were for not knowing something and why didn't you RTFM, read the fine manual, read the fantastic manual, maybe other decodes there, but I'm really committed to creating an environment where it is okay to ask questions.
Yeah.
You get to resolution so much faster, not just as an individual trying to grow, but for your organization. If you're scaring people about asking questions, what kind of holding back are you doing to your whole team? So
one of the most important turning points in my life, I'll be totally honest, is around that topic.
Okay.
I was a soldier, right?
Okay.
I was about brutal efficiency. I'd work 100 hours a week and I didn't care.
Sure.
And we'd have a project team working. And Scott, if you were on the project team and I didn't think you'd add value, I would tell you that, right?
Well, thank you for that, Ernest.
Scott, you don't add value. This is what's going to happen. You're not going to attend these meetings anymore. I'm going to include you as a part of the project team and you're going to get a bonus at the end of the year. I just want you to say thank you, right?
And stay out of my way.
That's right. That is not a way to make friends.
Yeah.
And I worked for a guy named Mark Tierney, who you may know is the CTO over at ONUG. We worked together at Fidelity, and he was my boss. And he pulled me aside one day, and he goes, Ernest, you could be amazing. He goes, the problem is you cut people out. You don't bring them in. He's like, you need to build a team. And your job as a leader is to dig the nugget of wisdom out of everybody at the table and help them feel like they connect. And so I went home, talked to my wife, right? This is a big emotional commitment. Sure. I made some changes. 6 months later, Mark says, hey, you're doing a really great job, right? He goes, the problem is no one believes a word of it. And then he said to me, Ernest, he goes, you need to make people believe that you care about them. Or better yet, why don't you just care?
Right.
And so
you don't have to convince people of something.
Yeah.
If you really,
and so I went and talked to my wife again and said, I got to emotionally and intellectually invest myself in others. I can't use that as a wall. And I went and apologized to the people that I had offended. And that was a cornerstone for my entire career. I got promoted. I built, relationships that last a lifetime. And I try to live in the now, and I try to connect with every person that I meet. And, I'm not always successful, but I try to be genuine, open, and really care about the people that I talk to and interact with.
Yeah. I've used a version of that. It helps if you really care.
Yeah.
Right.
It's great advice.
Yeah.
But you can't just say it.
Yeah.
You've got to mean it.
Yeah. I think too, you've been in leadership positions, you are in a leadership position. And if you really want to engage with your team, you can't fake it.
You
right?
can't.
It really takes rolling up sleeves, going to lunch, going out after work, having those conversations, caring about the other things in their lives. Right?
Yeah.
So,
especially, the startup where I'm at now,
sure.
I'm elbow deep with a handful of people. It's not like I'm, at the head of a 5,000 person organization. And, I can't ask one of my folks to work 80 hours this week if I'm not going to work 80 hours, if I'm not going to be in the trench swinging with them. And so that's really the esprit de corps, to use another military term.
Sure.
It's something that's really important to me.
I had a very formative experience at Bell Atlantic on that front. One of my first bosses there, a guy named Larry Galvin. Larry, I don't know if you listen to this podcast, but I'm going to embarrass you here. he would come in and do, the 2 a.m. Sunday morning maintenance with us, sitting on the data center floor, pulling cable, and he totally led by example, right?
Yeah.
And that really matters. So there's a jump here from you understand, the financial side of the industry, you understand a lot of the technology required to deliver it, and you ended up this little company called Gluware. So how did that happen? And tell us what you're doing at Gluware.
Yeah, absolutely. So I'd known Jeff Gray a long time through ONUG.
And Jeff is?
Jeff Gray's the CEO of Gluware, an absolutely wonderful guy. I've worked with a lot of people in my life, and I really, really enjoy working at Gluware. I was having a conversation with another major financial to go and run infrastructure and cyber risk, and I was just about to accept. And Jeff and I had a catch up sort of out of the blue. And
Sure.
I mentioned that I was going to be making a change. And he's like, hey, we've just had this big round of investment. We're looking for a chief product officer. I really want a customer.
Sure.
And a customer that really understands this, not only how automation works, but the whole business process of the whole nine. He goes, would you think about coming to Gluware? And I thought, between ONUG and sort of having my stamp on the industry there, I was like, well, what do I really have left to do?
Right.
And I was like, I'd love to get a company, built and grown. I was like, you know what? Okay, let's do this. And then, financial services can take a toll after a while.
Yeah.
So I was ready to do
I've heard
a little something different. And so I joined, the team out in Sacramento. I still live in Dallas, obviously. And, and I've been the chief product officer here for 3.5 years.
What has that been like for you? You were a consumer, you had to deal with product management teams, and now you are the person who won't give every customer exactly what they want.
Yeah, you're the way you said that sounded just like me in our stand-ups and stuff. Right?
Okay. All right.
So a couple of things, right? The stress is totally different. Working at a bank is real, pressure on you 24/7, right? Your people need to get access to their money. There's regulatory compliance problems, the whole nine. With Gluware, it's like, how do we grow? How do we build the product? What's the information we need to make that decision? What's the market doing? What are our peers doing, right? What are our customers asking us to do? And what I love to tell everybody is when you work for corporate America, even as a senior executive, Brian Moynihan's setting the tone, right? Even as a senior executive, he's going to tell you, you need to save $20 million and here's your P&L. And, I might have to go talk to the consumer CTO to say, what's your plans? Oh, I'm going to grow top line revenue for credit cards by 10%. Okay, well, I know I need this many servers, et cetera.
Sure.
There's no one telling us what's going on here.
Right.
We have to make those decisions.
Right.
And that's a whole different kind of pressure, which I absolutely love it. It's like, okay, what would I do? What would I expect as a customer? And I've brought some folks from history, that I've worked with.
Cool.
Of course, like Mike Howe,
sure.
Kevin Irwin, Oleg and team, just folks who also understand and have been in the trenches and fought these battles so that we can have a reasonable discussion to say, hey, you know what? You've just asked me to add support for a device that was end of support 13 years ago. I'm probably going to say no to that. Right. And then, hey, maybe it's something we will invest in, or maybe we have the tough conversation. Yes, we'll do it, but you need to sign on the dotted line first, right?
For sure.
Yeah.
Do you have, would you draw distinctions between those network infrastructure decisions that you were on, the consumer side of versus things that are very operationally focused, like automation products?
That's an interesting question. I think in the end, they're a lot more alike than you'd think.
Okay.
Right? When you're making network infrastructure decisions, especially if you're taking a product-based approach, you really need to think about the life cycle end to end.
Sure.
And while an architect kind of gets a lot of glory for that high-level design and choice,
yep,
the people on the ground that are using the product and dealing with the consequences every day are the operators.
That is correct.
So there really needs to be a front-to-back approach to both of those decisions, right?
Okay.
So when I'm thinking, always, when I'm on the enterprise side thinking about a product, I think about what's my path to production, right? My path to operations.
Sure. What
do I need to test? How does that need to be validated? What are the situations and use cases that need to be done? And then how would I, as an operator, operate it? And a lot of that falls directly into the experience here at Gluware, right? Where what automation do we want to bring to bear is based on that experience, right?
Right.
So today, people talk about, what tasks do I need to operate, right? Well, if you're doing a product-based service delivery, you can't just think about the tasks that are low-hanging fruit.
Right.
You have to think about, how am I going to fundamentally operate this platform from the start, from the first day I deploy it, to how I maintain it, to how I troubleshoot it, and then how do I exit it from the environment?
Sure.
And so I think about the automation standpoint from that. So I don't necessarily think about the tasks, because if I handle all the things I need to do to deploy, maintain, and then lifecycle out, all of a sudden the tasks are taken care of too.
If people can elevate to like thinking about workflow end to end,
you got it.
What are the processes that I need to put in place? And I do have a little, burr under my saddle about the lack of understanding of workflow in many shops today. And we're going to be doing more episodes on that specifically. And I'll go back to my industrial engineering background and the whole W. Edwards Deming, stuff that he did from a manufacturing engineering perspective. It's 100% applicable to these conversations today.
That's right. It's not fair in a lot of ways, right? When I was a network engineer in the 2000s, it was the Wild West.
Sure.
Right?
Oh, yeah.
We all made our bones based on what we could accomplish as individuals. And now here we are in the Wild West of network automation. We're telling people, you can't make your bones based on the individual success that you have, right? And so it is a little bit unfair, but ultimately the people who are on the ground today that figure out that process is the most important part, that you aren't delivering automation to make your life easier, because your company's paying you for a business outcome.
Sure.
How does that automation reflect the value the company's getting out of the services you're providing? That will get you raises. That will get you recognition. That will help you be one of those technical managers that can make a difference,
Sure.
right? And for the people who make the transition into senior leadership, it gets you a business role, right? So there's a real path if the folks that listen to your podcast use some of those paths like we've talked about to really elevate their career by understanding the value of process, the value of software architecture, and really taking a more holistic approach to what they're trying to accomplish.
Sure. I'll note that as I've gotten to know you and Gluware over the past couple of years, like I remember having a conversation with you in 2023.
Mm-hmm.
I think a lot of it revolved around a friend of ours, Jeremy Schulman.
Love Jeremy.
Yeah, absolutely. Very, very well known for the path that he's hacked through the forest on network automation, and learning a little bit about ONUG starting back then too, but watching the progress and the important pivots that Gluware is engaging in. Like I see you working really hard to, like we know integrations are important, and for integrations we need to provide APIs. There are other players in the industry. You just made a big announcement about working with Red Hat Ansible today. What has that looked like behind closed doors for you guys, as much as you're willing to share?
No, I think we're pretty open. We're fairly transparent about this, right? At first we wanted to be a platform of automation that people consume at the enterprise level, so they didn't have to fight through the same mistakes over and over again, right? And ultimately, what we found is that that integration component, that openness to the community has made a big difference. And this partnership with Red Hat kind of really solidifies the transformation we've been doing for quite some time about making ourselves more open. And that's really the Ansible collection. We wanted to be at the top of the heap initially, right? And then we realized that you don't have to be at the top of the heap, right? It's about the integration. And so working with Ansible Automation Platform, having Ansible be able to call directly to the APIs from Gluware. So when you start getting away into the complex, the config, drift, and audit, the areas where automation can potentially get bogged down, we can fit in. And now it's not about who's on top. It's about us being able to help and accelerate you. And then ultimately, it's about how do we make our software available to the community with the community edition. We'll be releasing our IDE later, and then just letting people get their hands on and play with it and see what the differences are between out-of-the-box packaged automation versus having to create all that on your own. And, if I could, just the big differentiator is that what we call DIAL, the device interaction and automation layer. You don't have to worry about the individual commands, right? And maintaining a big script repo. We handle all that for you. So you're really focused on the business outcome. And that's really what we want our customers to be thinking about, which is, I've got these really, really hard things to do already. I need to move my business forward. Figuring out what 10 different versions of set port enable is probably not going to provide the value you need long term. So how do we help? How do we accelerate? And that's really what we're focused on.
So that's all cool. Let's change gears a little bit. And we dropped ONUG and NAF here in the conversation.
We have.
Talk about ONUG. What is it? There are people who are aware of it. There are people who aren't. how did you get started with it? And
absolutely. It's a cool story. It's the Open Network Users Group. In 2012, I went to speak at ONF, the ONS Summit, right? Yep. And I was really talking about the promise of software-defined networking, of course. Where's wood here, right? Like that.
So there's particle board under here somewhere.
I love the idea of a centralized controller and moving away from, individual islands of decision-making capability. And when I got done speaking, it was a really pretty energetic, event. And I went to the leaders and I said, hey, you've got all these vendors that sit on your board. Like, you're not going to get anywhere. They're going to bog everything down. They're just looking for competitive advantage. Why don't you bring the users in and ask them what they need and coalesce those requirements? And they were like, that's a terrible idea. They really wanted the board. They wanted a paid board membership. And I totally understand why they did that. That was certainly the trend at the time.
Sure.
And so there was a third person standing right nearby. His name's Nick Lippis.
Sure.
And Nick pulled me aside and he goes, this is a great idea. And if you sponsor the very first one at Fidelity, I'll help organize it, and we'll bring it into a whole sort of event. And so we had the very first one in the spring of 2013. And our goal really is, let's get the customers together to talk.
Right.
Back then, and even now in a lot of ways, we all make the same mistakes. We all certify the same gear. We all find the same bugs. We all have to overcome the same problems.
Sure.
If we share our experiences, maybe we can shortcut this adoption faster.
Right.
And at first it was around, software-defined infrastructure. Then it became about adopting cloud. And now obviously it's moving into AI.
Right. Yep. So that's interesting. There's a lot more commonality there than I would have plugged originally. One of the things that's been really foundational for Network Automation Forum is bringing the implementers together on the customer side to talk about what they're doing. And the incredible connection in the community has been people who are willing to ask for help. Back to a thread of conversation here, help me. I need to know how to do this better. I don't know where to start. Can you help me? And I know some things I can help you too. There's a real two-way street here amongst the fingers on keyboard community. I think ONUG is more at the decision-making level.
Yeah, right.
And, to use the more crass analogy, beards and suits. Sorry, that comes from a Neil Stephenson novel. It works for me. And I'm like, I have this real burning concern for us versus them. Like, there's too much of it in our industry. And this isn't about either one of our organizations. I mean, engineers versus, decision makers. And I want to find ways to make those connections stronger and say, we can go a lot farther if we're in sync with each other. We don't have to replace each other's jobs or anything.
Sure.
But teamwork really matters. So that's something that's on my mind. We'll keep talking about it for years, I'm sure. So, so you had an official capacity with ONUG for a long time.
Yeah, right.
Yeah. So I can't remember what that was.
Absolutely. So I was the co-chairman and co-founder. I'm still the co-founder of ONUG with Nick. But one of the very first rules we created was you can't have any vendors on the decision-making board.
Okay.
Right. And the reason why was because it always needed to be about the user. And I created that rule. And so when I went to work for a vendor, I could no longer be in the decision-making body. So I talked to Nick. I said, I love you. I'm here if there's any questions. You know what I mean? Yep. This is something I need to do. It's a little bit different. And, Gluware is still a part of ONUG. And I'm, still get together and find out what's going on. So I stay current. But I can't, if I'm a vendor, I can't be making those kinds of decisions on behalf of users. So I took just a little bit of a step back when I came to Gluware 3 years ago.
No, that makes perfect sense. And, credit to you for doing that, right?
Yep.
I mean, we have a similar attitude here with NAF. We don't handle it exactly the same way, but we want to be very inclusive. Like, we're a table for people to talk, and anybody who wants to advance the cause of network automation has a seat at the table.
Yeah.
Whether they're an end user, whether they're a professional services organization, whether they're a vendor.
Sure.
Right. And as everybody can play by those rules politely and nicely. And thankfully, that's happened pretty consistently in the 2 years that we've been in existence. So
yeah, we found we brought the vendors and the users together in the working groups.
Right.
And that was really something that in the early days produced a tremendous amount of fruit. And the Conrad Meneses during the early days produced the whole SD-WAN RFP process, which was still in use 10 years later, And so I think those kinds of outcomes are great. And the discourse is really what matters. And I think what you guys have gotten right in NAF right out of the gate is we're all in this together. right? And let's have the discussions. And then, hey, vendors, help us, right?
Yep.
And tell the story, and then take what we're talking about and potentially make it into better products. And
right.
Who doesn't love that?
Yeah. And I feel like the dialogue that we've had so far with end users and vendors in the room, there's been some interesting debates from the floor in Amsterdam last year in particular. That was AutoCon 1. Like, that's really constructive. And there doesn't have to be one way of looking at everything here.
Yeah, right.
And we understand, like, I'm also a pretty firm believer in everybody's biased, right? And their way of calling that is perspective, right? Everybody has a perspective, right? And your perspective is formed by your life experiences and where you get your paycheck from.
That's right.
And there's nothing wrong or evil about that. That's just real. As long as you recognize where your biases are, you can figure out, okay, how do we triangulate to do something constructive together?
Yeah, I could not agree more with that. Yeah, I'm certainly biased now, right?
Yeah. Well, again, it's like a comet, right? You're flying through space. Something hits you, you might change your trajectory, but
right.
Your bias has been impacted a little bit.
I committed.
Yeah, very good. Well, as we start to wind this down, so you've got this really interesting career of experiences. Are there any other nuggets that we haven't touched here to say, hey, new in career person in network engineering, you in a NetOps role, what are a couple things they could take away from the life of Ernest Lefner? Sorry, I don't mean to make that past tense.
A tear going down my eye. Yeah, exactly.
What would you want to leave folks with?
A lot of it I think is blocking and tackling, we'll say. The first thing I'll say is it's your career, right? What you put into it is what you get out of it. You don't magically get promoted. You don't magically get raises. You need to provide more value. And if you're standing there watching people get promoted and you're kind of wondering why not me, there's only one place to look, and that's in the mirror, right? And I think a lot of people struggle with that concept, and it gets harder and harder as time goes on.
Personal accountability, is that what you're talking about?
Yeah, you got it.
Let me write that down.
Absolutely right.
Personal accountability.
It's I know it sounds silly, but at the end of the day, people don't necessarily understand that they're accountable for themselves, right? Well, my boss didn't tell me to do this, or I didn't understand I was supposed to do that. It's like, well, how much of that really could you have figured out? And that's the difference between the people who really excel and the people who don't, being able to understand what's coming next. Yeah. And that's, we talked about the business logic, the requirements. That's really what that's about. It's about looking into the future, knowing where you need to be, and then meeting the ball where it is versus waiting for it to come to you. I think that's the first big piece. And the second is your career's not set in stone. I know a lot of people like to make a list, like, oh, I've got an ops job today, and tomorrow I want to do this, then on Friday I want to do that. It's all about opportunity. And opportunity presents itself in a variety of different ways. Did I ever think that I'd be the chief product officer at Gluware? No.
Was not a career goal.
Yeah, right. But when the opportunity presented itself, I said, well, I could go be a managing director at a financial services firm and keep doing what I'm doing, or I could take
that
a chance.
Pressure.
Yeah, with that pressure. Exactly. And so what I tell everybody is be open to the experience. Maybe you're a network engineer today and you get an opportunity to go work on cloud. Don't necessarily poo-poo that because it's not where you envisioned your career to go. Life is this crazy, wild journey, and be open to the opportunities that are going to come. The more open you are and the more you vary your skill set and your experience, the more likely you are to find the opportunities that you want.
Look at the points in the timeline that we've seen here, like moving from being focused on networking technologies to trying to figure out this cloud thing to really trying to work with different automation tools to now what is agentic AI going to do to me in my career? And there isn't I can only go down this path or this path or this path. It's all additive.
Right.
You got to be open to adding new tools to your tool belt.
That's right. And I think people are really afraid of that. They're in it, they get up in the morning, they drive to work, or they, sit at their desk and they do this activity and they think, well, if this activity stops, then, what's going to happen to me? And I think the answer is, we're going to grow so much with what we can do and what we can accomplish. There's room for everyone to transition their skill sets.
Yep.
So instead of thinking about, hey, what's this task that I'm doing? Think about how does this new technology impact that task, and how do I get it there faster?
Yeah.
Because I guarantee, maybe at your current job something might happen, but there's a million other companies out there that need that experience, and there's always going to be a home if you elevate your experience based on the technology and opportunities that are provided.
And the tweak I just put on that is it's not necessarily a transition as much as it is adding on and layering in new skills, because you got it. You're not replacing something in your brain with new knowledge. It's the sum of, you're the comet. You've been hit by this. You've been hit by cloud. You've been hit by AI, and it changes your trajectory. But you're still moving. So.
And we talked about digging the nuggets of wisdom. Back when 30 years ago, when we were BERT testing circuits,
yes.
right, and understanding what loopback was,
right,
that still has value today. Those troubleshooting skills, it's still one logical chain. And so, when you see somebody out there going, "Oh, back in my day," there's a nugget of wisdom that's there. Don't be afraid to embrace it.
For sure. Okay, we end with the 2 fun questions.
All right,
and I did not prep you for these questions.
It's okay.
So, the first one is, and I'll state it the worst way possible first, and then I'll give you an out.
Okay.
What's the worst outage you've ever caused? Or if that can't be disclosed, the most interesting outage you've ever seen from a distance.
Okay. I can tell you, so this is going to sound crazy, I've never really had a big outage.
Okay.
I knocked out 3 investor centers with a bad route map for 3 days.
That's not a bad outage?
Well, like some folks knocked out disconnected fidelity from the internet, like those kinds of outages.
Okay, fair enough. Sure.
But what I will say is, one day I was working on the training floor and I was getting configs ready for the weekend, and I ran a Solaris box back then. So I had 50,000 terminal windows open. Yep. Now, if you remember those 3-button Solaris mouses,
I do,
right?
Yep. I was a Solaris administrator a long time ago. So
one of the things I had for the department back in the day too. And I was copying content from a switch to put in my project plan. And as I did that, I passed a second switch, and my big fat meat hook fingers dumped the entire config into that switch during the middle of the market day.
Wow.
I was paralyzed. I was locked up. And when I finally could get my fingers to move, I called operations on the phone. I was like, I screwed up. Help me. And the guy, Jim Creasy at the time, he quickly logged into the switch, and he saw that there was a caret at the top of the terminal that threw everything off by 1 character.
Oh, man.
That would have been an instant turn. I would have been terminated immediately. There was just... And that's back when, it was enabled, right? So you had an enable password. It wasn't TACAX. And so...
Yeah. Wow.
Doomed.
Yeah.
Doomed.
Kids, yet another reason to not cut and paste configs.
Yeah. Absolutely.
And then the other fun question, back when you actually had to sit on maintenance windows in the middle of the night, what was your go-to music for the maintenance window music?
Oh, the maintenance window?
What's your catalog look
probably
like?
The sound of myself sobbing.
Okay. Well,
or solitaire on the old Windows boxes. You know what I mean?
Click.
Just
click.
Doing something to pass the time in between yelling at vendors to fix stuff.
That's right. Yes. No, we were very used to that. Very cool. Well, look, thank you so much for spending time here today on Total Network Operations. We'll have you again some other time.
Anytime.
And thank you to you listeners for investing your time with us. Really want to hear your feedback. You can hit me on LinkedIn via a DM, or you can hit us on packetpushers.net/follow-up. Thanks again, and we'll see you next time on Total Network Operations.